Okay, let's go ahead and finish this out. So let's get started. 1950s coming to an end. So we kind of, at the beginning, talked a lot about the Cold War, the origins of the Cold War. We actually even talked about FDR and Truman, the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, the Berlin Airlift, even talked about the Korean War. A lot of people say it's the Forgotten War. And then we largely started focusing on the 1950s social aspects, the suburbs, the families, the baby boom, the GI Bill, the highways, all that kind of stuff like that. Cars, consumerism. It basically is the 1920s, but just a little bit different. Housewives. But then we kind of took a step back and we looked at civil rights. Definitely part of the domestic aspect, but definitely a challenging part. It's almost like war on the domestic front for a lot of these African Americans. Of course, Martin Luther King Jr., all that kind of stuff like that. Rosa Parks, the Little Rock Nine, Brown versus Board, even threw in couple other court cases, Delgado versus Bastrop, Mexican integration. We also talked about sit-ins. We talked about boycotts. Finally, Eisenhower takes and, passes the Civil Rights Act of 1957. But just because the federal government says to do something, Little Rock in example, doesn't mean they're automatically going to do it in the South. But now what we need to do is we kind of need to come back to the Cold War. You probably already should have had this slide down, okay, while you were listening. Dien Bien Phu, oh wow, Vietnam. So we already talked about the Korean War, how North Korea communist, South Korea non-communist. We basically have to help South Korea because what color runs? Red. Now with that, after the siege, Vietnamese communists under Ho Chi Minh defeated the French colonial forces in 1954. What ends up happening is Vietnam used to be a French colonial. With that, communists are going to take and win over the northern part of Vietnam. And it's going to be, I'm not kidding you, it is a picture perfect mirror image basically of Korea. The North tries to take over the South. We don't want red spreading. We try and help the South out. Now in Korea, it was the UN trying to help the South out, and we were leading it. MacArthur was leading it, but in Vietnam, it's going to be all us. The Geneva Accords divide actually Vietnam, just like, at Yalta, they divided Korea, but this one's going to be at the 17th parallel, right about here in the South China Sea. With that, you now have two Vietnams, North being communist, South being non-communist. The United States assumed the chief responsibility providing the anti-communist South Vietnam with aid. Now, with that, this is going to be something that we're going to basically be looking at for the next week or two. It starts out in the 1950s. JFK will somewhat help. It will not become the full-blown Vietnam War until LBJ. There's a couple other things Cold War-wise we need to know about the 1950s before we move on. One of the biggest things is a little thing called Sputnik. There it is. Now, I think you guys may already know a little bit about this, but let's go ahead, pause, get this down, and let me tell you about Sputnik. Okay? Sputnik. Out beside this slide, or actually, no, it's on the slide. I probably should just have you circle it, save you some time. Sputnik is the first man-made satellite ever to orbit the Earth. Are we clear? Sputnik. But wait a second. Sputnik? That sounds like a Russian saying it. Sputnik. What? Reading on, it says in 1958, literally, or 1957, the Soviet Union launches Sputnik. Which means, did they beat us at something? Oh, that sucks. So with that, that's going to hurt us a little bit. Sputnik being launched on October 4th, 1957 is going to jolt the United States into action. Eisenhower in 1958, wasting no time at all, creates the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, otherwise known as NASA. The Russians literally beat us into space, and the United States starts to freak out. Look at this New York Times headline. Soviet fires Earth satellite into space. It's circling the globe at 18,000 miles per hour. Sphere tracked 4 crossings over the U.S. I'm going to be honest with you. In the Red Scare of the 1950s and post-war Cold War craziness, we flip out. Sputnik basically makes Americans kind of pee their pants a little bit. And Eisenhower says, nope, we now need to create NASA. We also need to hunt down some communists. Joseph McCarthy's going to talk about this. But literally, Sputnik is going to scare us to death to the tune of the fact that he creates NASA. Now, the effects on the U.S., we are not only going to fear their technological advancements, but now, because we created the bomb, but guess what? If they can put a satellite into space, do they probably have a bomb? Oh yeah, they have a bomb. And now they're tracking the United States. So with that, that scares the bejibbers out of us. Americans resolve to regain the technological advantage. It is here that we decide that we're probably going to need to outdo them. So instead of putting a satellite, we're going to put hopefully a man in space. And then, of course, when JFK comes in, he says, I'm going to put a man on the moon, but that won't be till 1960. In 1958, I'd already told you NASA was created by Eisenhower, but there's one more thing you need to know. Big old star down here. Hope you got it down. Okay, 1958, the National Defensive Education Act basically puts these two things, math and science, into your curriculum. You guys know that a long time ago, well, not a long time ago, a couple years ago, they had to do the 4x4 where you had to have 4 maths and 4 sciences. Well, guess what? You know where that came from? That came from Sputnik. When they launch Sputnik, it will scare us so much that the United States will not only create NASA, but they'll also create demands on your education. So how has this affected you? How many of y'all taken pre-cal, calculus? How many of y'all taken 4 years of science? Oh wait, all of y'all? That never would have happened if it hadn't have been for the launching of Sputnik. Again, remember what I told you. The Cold War is a Cold War because there's no actual fighting. It's basically a 40-year-long, I'm better, no, my government's better, no, my government's better between the Soviet Union. So because of Sputnik, things like fallout shelters, bomb shelters, do these look kind of interesting? This is where this starts to happen. The ducking cover, and I'm going to actually show you guys a video of a ducking cover. You know, our tornado drills, they had those on a weekly basis, but they would go down into these bomb shelters because they were scared of nuclear annihilation. The duck and cover drills, that's where they come from. Okay, we have lock and secure drills because in our generation we're scared of school shootings. Well, back then they would get under their desk and they would do this for fear of nuclear attack. So definitely going to be something you need to know about. Now, the other stuff that we need to talk about, Second Red Scare in particular. Okay, let me see here. I think I didn't put it right in order. Oh no. Okay, Second Red Scare. Let's go ahead and take this first. Okay. I think that's what's coming next in your notes. Red Scare. You need to know the name of one person in particular. Oh my lordy, do you need to know his name? Senator Joseph McCarthy. Okay, Joseph McCarthy is a senator in the United States during the 1950s, and he is largely responsible for some of the biggest hysteria in the 1950s regarding communists in the State Department. In fact, he says he has a list of 205 government officials that are communists. McCarthyism is going to be termed McCarthyism, to destroy or assassinate one's character without any proof. This guy goes running around the government and says, you're a communist, you're a communist, you're a communist. I have a list of communists. Every time he says your name and you're a communist, your basically life is over. Your mom won't even take your phone call. It becomes a witch hunt. In fact, that's something I want you to circle, a witch hunt. In fact, we looked at in the 1920s, like the Sacco and Vanzetti and the Red Scare of that, and we compared it to the Salem witch trials. This, in all reality, is the biggest comparison to the Salem witch trials. They actually started making Americans pledging loyalty oaths. Eisenhower actually signed that into law. Also in the 1950s, this is one super important. Make sure you add this in. U.S. added "In God We Trust" to not only our money, but also our Pledge of Allegiance. So every single morning when you say, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, yada, 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 in literally one nation under God, that was added during the 1950s to promote democracy, Christianity, and loyalty to the United States. So that is something that you absolutely have to think about. Was that really needed? No. Are we traditionally a Judeo-Christian basic Judeo-Christian country? Yes, but that was added in the 1950s. It was never there in the beginning. Now, this one doesn't have a slide, but added up on the top. There's one more thing you really got to know about the McCarthyism, the hysteria, Red Scare of the 1950s. It's a little bit of a secret program. That was definitely something I would write, a secret program. You probably even just need to write this. A counterintelligence program initiated by the United States. Literally, this project produced some of the most important breakthroughs of Western counterintelligence of this period. You guys can take and paraphrase this. project was one of the most sensitive secrets. It literally remained a secret. The whole goal of the Venona Project is to break secret code and find out who's communist and who's non-communist. I'll be honest with you, the Venona Project, okay, it is basically our very first Patriot Act, where we are starting to listen to people's conversations. Now, there is one thing in particular you need to make sure you have up at the very top. This is going to be the project that basically undermines or tells the secret of a couple called Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. A lot of people say that they were Soviet spies, and I'm going to be honest with you, he was. I don't know if she was, though. But with that, the Venona Project uncovers evidence. McCarthy's going around saying they're communists. Venona Project gets evidence. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg will be executed for being spies, espionage. So it's going to get very real in the United States in the 1950s when it comes to this kind of stuff. Now, the next slide right here, HUAC, House Committee for Un-American Activities. Well, if it's un-American, it must be communist. In 1950s, really starting in the 50s, Congress is going to start investigating Americans as they think are communist. HUAC is going to be a committee that basically, I'll be honest with you, they violate your rights. They basically call witnesses. They demand to know your alliances. They demand to know if you're communist. They demand to know if you think the government's right or wrong. There's going to be a guy in particular, Alger Hiss, who's basically found guilty of spying and sentenced to 10 years in prison. The person who is investigating him, you're going to notice, it's the Vice President of the United States. Here he is, Richard Nixon. There's going to be all kinds of propaganda according to HUAC and according to McCarthyism and according to all this kind of stuff like that. In fact, there is also something else that I don't know if I didn't give you a part in the slide, but I will go ahead and tell you, maybe add it in. There's something called the Hollywood 10 in the 1950s and the 1940s as well. It's 10 people in Hollywood who are suspected of being communists, and a lot of the people in Hollywood are going to be actually questioned for their communist leanings. A lot of people think, actually, look at who they pulled up, Walt Disney. Hollywood 10. Basically, it was a list of people under suspicions, and when the Hollywood 10 refused to be questioned, they were actually thrown in jail as being in contempt. And so, seriously, HUAC has unbelievable power. So between HUAC, between McCarthy, between the Venona Project, there is a lot of craziness going on in the 1950s. But it's okay, because we added under God into the Pledge of Allegiance. Kind of crazy, but I don't have a problem with it all. But I can understand how people would see maybe that's a little propaganda-ish. Now, with that, 1959, last slide you got here. Castro takes power. You need to know this because, again, it's another country turning what color? Red. Now, July 1st, 1959, communist forces under Fidel Castro take over Cuba. Castro is going to nationalize this sugar industry, which also is going to stink for us because, we were doing trade with them. Economically, it's going to hurt us a little bit. Also, he signs a trade agreement with the Soviet Union. So here's the deal. 90 miles away, Cuba just turned red. Do you think we're going to start to freak out? Of course we are. In 1960, who was elected, it says down at the bottom of your notes, JFK. JFK is going to basically come head-to-head with the Soviet Union over Castro because Castro is going to say, yeah, it's okay, Soviet Union. Go ahead and put missiles 90 miles away from the U.S. We're going to balk at that a little bit. So, summary, big picture, the end of the 1950s, you are going to have Vietnam turn a little bit red. You're going to have Sputnik launched. Ooh. You're going to have Eisenhower come back and say, okay, we'll create NASA and put a little more math and science in the Defense Education Act. You're going to have the Red Scare, or rather, let's be honest with you, the second Red Scare, it's really known as McCarthyism because McCarthy starts a lot of hysteria, Senator McCarthy. A secret project in the Venona Papers, taking and investigating, and we actually execute 2 people, the Rosenbergs, who are basically, I think she was innocent. I don't know about him. HUAC is questioning people like, I don't know, Walt Disney about being communist, and Castro takes power. The 1950s are pretty crazy. All right, we're done.